There is a look that Johnny Carson had that was different from all his other looks, and that every person who worked with him or appeared across from him or watched him for any sustained period of time learned to recognize and to be slightly afraid of. Not in the way that you are afraid of something hostile or aggressive or dangerous in the conventional sense, but in the way that you are afraid of something precise, of something that has found you with an accuracy that leaves no room for the usual defenses, of something that sees the thing you were hoping it would not see and shows you that it has seen it without saying a word about what it has seen and without needing to say a word, because the seeing itself is sufficient and the person being seen understands that it is sufficient and that nothing that follows is going to change what the look has already established between the two of them. It was not a cruel look. Cruelty was not Carson's register. It was the look of complete and total comprehension of a man who had spent 30 years learning to read the specific and complicated text of human beings presenting themselves for public examination, and who had developed for that reading the specific and devastating fluency of someone who had done it so many times and with such complete attention that very little remained opaque to him. That the gap between what people showed and what they were had been narrowed by decades of close observation to the point where it was almost non-existent, where what they showed and what they were visible simultaneously to anyone who knew how to look, and Carson always knew how to look. The Hollywood legend who received the look on the night in question arrived at the studio with everything a Hollywood legend carries, which is everything and which is also, paradoxically, nothing. Or at least nothing that can survive the specific conditions of a live television interview with a man who does not traffic in the same currency that everything represents. The currency of Hollywood, the currency of fame and reputation, and the carefully managed impression that decades of public visibility create in the minds of the people who consume the visibility without ever accessing the person underneath it, was not a currency that Carson traded in. He had his own currency. He had been building it for 30 years, one night at a time, one genuine moment at a time, through the accumulation of a relationship with the American public that was different in kind from the relationship that Hollywood built with its audiences, that was built not on the constructed image, but on the daily and consistent and completely reliable reality of who he was behind the desk. People trusted him. Not the way they trusted a brand or a persona or a carefully managed celebrity image, the way they trusted a person. The way you trust someone you have seen enough times in enough different situations to understand what they actually are rather than what they are presenting as. Carson had earned that trust over 30 years, and it had given him something that the Hollywood legend sitting across from him, for all the fame and the reputation and the carefully constructed mythology, did not have, which was the specific authority of someone whose relationship with reality was unquestioned by the people watching. The Hollywood legend had arrived believing what Hollywood legends usually believe when they arrive at a television studio for an interview, which is that the interview is a controlled environment in which the controlled version of themselves will be the thing that is presented to the audience, and in which the presentation of that controlled version is the function that the interview serves, that the interviewer is a vehicle for the presentation rather than a genuine interlocutor who has his own perspective on the person being interviewed and his own capacity to see past the presentation to whatever is behind it. This belief was not unreasonable. It was based on considerable evidence. Most television interviews did function this way. Most television interviewers were content to receive what was offered and to help present it to the audience in the most flattering available light, partly because that was what the format required, and partly because the alternative, genuinely engaging with the gap between the presentation and the reality, was professionally risky in ways that most television interviewers were not willing to risk. Carson was not most television interviewers. He was not willing to simply receive what was offered, not because he was confrontational or aggressive or interested in the specific kind of damage that some interviewers inflicted on their subjects as a form of career building, but because he was genuinely curious, and the genuine curiosity produced in him the specific and entirely natural response to something that was not quite real, which was to look at it until he could see what was underneath it. He looked. The first minutes of the interview proceeded the way the first minutes of interviews on The Tonight Show almost always proceeded, with the warmth and the humor and the specific quality of professional ease that Carson brought to the opening of every conversation, regardless of who the guest was or what the conversation was going to become. He was good at the opening. He had done 30 years of openings, and they had never become perfunctory or mechanical for him, had never lost the quality of genuine welcome that made the guests feel, at least at the beginning, that they were somewhere safe, somewhere that wanted them to be their best rather than their most exposed, somewhere that was going to treat them well. The Hollywood legend relaxed into this. The Hollywood legend felt the warmth and responded to it with the specific invisible relaxation of someone whose guard has been lowered by a quality of reception that they were not fully expecting, who had arrived prepared for one thing and found another thing, and who was now adjusting to the found thing with the pleasant surprise of someone who had anticipated difficulty and found ease instead. And then Carson asked a question. It was not an aggressive question. It was not the kind of question that telegraphs its intent before the words have finished arriving, that announces itself as the thing the interviewer has been waiting to ask, that gives the subject time to see it coming and begin assembling the defenses before impact. It was a quiet question. A question that arrived in the conversation with the specific quality of something that had been waiting for exactly the right moment to be introduced, that had been present in Carson's mind since before the interview began, but that had been held until the conditions were right, until the conversation had reached a specific place where the question could land with the full weight of its actual significance, rather than being deflected by the defenses that would have been operational earlier in the exchange. He asked it in the tone he used for the questions that mattered, which was a tone that was not particularly different from the tone he used for the questions that did not matter, that gave no advance warning of the weight the question carried, that simply placed the question in the room with the specific and apparently casual ease of someone making a passing observation, rather than someone delivering the thing they came to deliver. The Hollywood legend heard the question. The hearing of it was visible in a way that the legend had not intended to be visible, in the way that things are visible when they have touched something real, and the thing that has been touched cannot prevent the touch from showing. For a moment, just a moment, the presentation slipped. Not dramatically, not in the way that produces gasps from the audience or the kind of visible disruption that is immediately recognizable as something going wrong. In the way that subtle things slip when the pressure on them exceeds the specific capacity of the mechanism holding them in place. In the way that makes one person at a dinner party notice something that the other 11 people at the table have completely missed. The presentation slipped, and Carson saw the slip, and the Hollywood legend saw Carson see it. And then Carson looked, not at the audience, not at the camera, at the Hollywood legend. Directly and completely, and with the full weight of 30 years of understanding exactly what he was looking at behind the 30 years of looking. He looked with the specific quality of someone who has seen something and is not going to pretend they have not seen it, who is not going to offer the polite fiction that the slip did not happen, who is not going to smooth over the moment with the professional warmth that had characterized the opening of the conversation and that was available to him, and that he was choosing not to deploy because the moment did not require warmth. The moment required something else. The moment required the specific and slightly terrible clarity of a man who sees things as they are, and who communicates that seeing through the look itself, through the simple and devastating and completely non-aggressive act of looking at someone in the full knowledge of what they are, and without any pretense of not knowing. The room went silent. Not immediately. The silence built the way silences build in rooms when something has happened that is altering the energy of the room without making any noise itself. When the change is occurring at a level below the audible, and the silence is the room's response to the change rather than a response to something loud that has happened. The audience felt it before they understood it. The co-host and the production staff felt it before they understood it. The cameras kept rolling because the cameras always kept rolling regardless of what was happening in their frame, but the people behind the cameras felt it, and the feeling was visible in the specific quality of their stillness. The stillness of people who have recognized that something is happening that they do not want to disturb by moving. The Hollywood legend was in the position that very few people who appeared across from Carson's desk ever found themselves in, which was the position of being seen, not observed, not interviewed, not presented with a question that required a managed response. Seen, with the specific and complete and slightly humbling quality of being seen by someone who does not have any investment in the seen version being comfortable or flattering or consistent with the version that has been constructed for public consumption, who simply sees what is there and communicates the seeing through the specific and extraordinary instrument of the look that 30 years had given him. The look that said, "I know what this is." The look that said the presentation and the reality are not the same thing, and I can see both of them, and I am not going to pretend otherwise, and you know that I am not going to pretend otherwise, and now we are here in this specific and slightly unprecedented situation together. A Hollywood legend tried to continue. This was the instinct, the deeply ingrained professional instinct of someone who had been managing their public image for decades and who had developed for that management the specific and durable habit of continuing regardless of what was happening, of finding the words and filling the silence and keeping the performance operational through whatever external pressure was being applied to it. The words came. They were the right words in the sense that they were the words that the situation called for from the perspective of someone who was trying to maintain the presentation under pressure. They were not the right words in the sense that they were not the true words, the words that corresponded to what was actually happening underneath the presentation, the words that the look had been inviting and that the performance was working to prevent from being spoken. Carson listened. He listened with the full attention that he always brought to listening, the attention of someone who was not simply waiting for the space to speak, but was genuinely present with what was being said, genuinely engaged with it, genuinely interested in the specific qualities of it that told him things about the person saying it that the content of the words themselves would not have told him. He listened and he heard the gap. The specific and audible gap between the words being said and the thing the words were working to avoid saying. He heard it the way he always heard these gaps, with the specific clarity of someone who has spent 30 years listening for exactly this thing, who has learned that the most important part of what anyone says in a conversation like this is not what they say, but the relationship between what they say and what they are not saying, the shape of the silence inside the speech. And then he did the thing that made the moment that people who were there still talked about when the conversation turned to the most extraordinary things they'd ever witnessed in that studio. He did not ask another question. He did not fill the silence. He did not rescue the Hollywood legend from the position they were in by providing the conversational bridge that would have allowed the presentation to recover and continue. He simply continued looking. He maintained the look through the words that were being said and through the space after the words had been said, continued it with the patience of someone who understood that patience in this specific kind of moment was not a passive thing but the most active thing available. That the doing of nothing was itself the doing of something, that the refusal to fill the silence was the fullest possible communication of what the silence needed to communicate. The Hollywood legend stopped speaking, not because there was nothing left to say from the perspective of the presentation, because the presentation could always generate more words. That was what presentations were designed to do. But because something in the quality of Carson's continued looking made the generating of more words feel like exactly the wrong response to the specific situation that had been created, because the look had established a context in which more words from the presentation were not more effective than fewer words but considerably less effective, in which the words themselves were becoming evidence of the thing the look had been showing, in which the continuing of the performance was making the gap between the performance and the reality more visible rather than less. The silence that followed was one of those silences that becomes a physical thing in a room, that takes up space and has weight, and that the people present experience not as the absence of sound but as the presence of something, of the specific and undeniable reality of a moment that has removed all the usual buffers between the people in it and what is actually happening between them. The audience felt it. It was visible in their faces and in their posture and in the specific quality of their collective attention, which had changed from the attention of people who were watching something entertaining to the attention of people who were witnessing something real, who were present for a moment that was outside the usual parameters of what happened in this room and that required from them the specific quality of attention that real things require, which is the attention of people who understand that what they are watching is not a performance but something that is actually happening and that they are actually there for. The Hollywood legend looked at Carson. Carson looked at the Hollywood legend. The look between them lasted long enough that it acquired a specific gravity of its own, long enough that it was no longer simply a look between two people in a conversation, but something that the conversation had produced and that the conversation was now organized around the thing that everything before it had been building toward and that everything after it would be building away from. In the look was the specific and complete and absolutely honest communication of two people who understood each other clearly in this specific moment, who had arrived at the same place by very different routes, and who were now in that place together, without any of the usual protective distance that public conversations maintain between the people having them. The Hollywood legend said something true. This was the outcome of the look, the specific and extraordinary outcome that the look had made possible by creating the conditions in which the true thing was more available than the managed thing, in which the gap between the presentation and the reality had been shown to be visible to someone who was not going to pretend otherwise, and who was going to continue not pretending otherwise regardless of how long it took. The Hollywood legend said something true that was not what they had come to the studio to say, that was not in the prepared version of the evening that they had rehearsed and managed and refined over the years of managing and refining such evenings. It was a small true thing. Not a confession or a revelation in the dramatic sense, something quieter than that, something that had the specific quality of something being allowed to surface for the first time in a long time, of something that had been submerged under the weight of the presentation for long enough that the surfacing of it was itself notable and significant regardless of the specific content of what surfaced. The true thing surfaced, the room heard it, Carson heard it, and his expression changed. Not to satisfaction, not to the expression of someone who has gotten what they came for, but to something warmer and more complicated than that, to the expression of someone who has been genuinely interested in another human being and has just been given, briefly and unexpectedly, the experience of the human being rather than the performance of the human being, which is the rarest and most valuable gift that his specific work could provide him, and that he never quite stopped being grateful for when it arrived. The audience exhaled, not all at once and not audibly, but in the specific and collective way that audiences exhale when tension has been held for long enough and has found somewhere to go. The co-hosts moved slightly, the small readjustments of people who have been holding themselves very still and are now permitted to release the stillness. The production team in the control room, who have been watching the monitors with the specific anxiety of people responsible for a program that was doing something the program had not planned to do, began the process of understanding that what had happened had been good television rather than the other kind, that the moment had resolved itself into something that served the program rather than into something that had required them to intervene. Carson did not make the moment bigger than it was. This was one of the things about him that the look itself had communicated, and that the moment had confirmed that he understood the appropriate size of things and had no interest in making them larger than the size they actually were, that the specific and genuine quality of what had just occurred between him and the Hollywood legend was something that deserved to be received at its actual size rather than inflated by the machinery of entertainment into something that exceeded what it actually was. He received it at its actual size. He acknowledged it with the specific and quiet warmth of someone who has been given something genuine and who values it and who does not need to perform the valuing in order for it to be real. He moved the conversation forward, not away from what had happened, not in the way that suggests that what had happened was something to be moved away from, but forward from it in the way that something that has been resolved moves forward rather than something that has been avoided, in the way that conversations move after a true thing has been said and the room has accommodated the truth of it and is now ready to continue on the basis of what the truth has established. The rest of the interview was different from the beginning of the interview, not dramatically different, not different in the way that would be immediately obvious to someone watching without the context of what had occurred, but different in the specific and consequential way that conversations are different after something real has entered them and changed the terms on which the conversation is proceeding. The Hollywood legend was different, not transformed. Not permanently altered by a single moment in a television studio, but slightly more present, slightly more genuinely engaged, slightly less invested in the management of the impression and slightly more interested in the actual exchange between two people who were now, in some small and genuine way, actually talking rather than performing talking. The audience felt the difference without being able to name it. Carson felt it and incorporated it into the conversation with the specific and unobtrusive skill of someone who has been creating the conditions for genuine conversation for 30 years and who knows how to handle what those conditions occasionally produce when they work. The Hollywood legend left the studio that evening with something that they had not arrived with, something that the look had given them, and that the true thing they had said in response to the look had confirmed in themselves as much as it had confirmed it to the room. The something was small, not a revelation or a transformation or a dramatic shifting of their understanding of who they were and what their life had been, small in the way that true things are often small, in the way that the specific and real and unmanaged human moment is always smaller than the performed version of itself, but also always more significant, because it is the thing rather than the representation of the thing, and the thing itself always has a weight that the representation can only approximate. They left with that, and Johnny Carson sat behind his desk and received his next guest and began the next conversation with the same quality of attention and the same genuine curiosity and the same patience and the same specific and extraordinary capacity to look at people until the look showed them something true that 30 years of doing this had built in him and that made every night behind the desk, for everyone who was fortunate enough to be in the room when it was working, something closer to a genuine human encounter than anything that the word television usually describes. The look was not a weapon. It was not a technique. It was not something that Carson deployed strategically in the way that interviewers deploy the tools of their craft to produce particular results. It was simply what happened when a man who was genuinely interested in human beings looked at a human being with the full weight of that genuine interest. When the curiosity that had been present in him since before he ever sat behind a desk and that 30 years behind the desk had deepened rather than depleted, was directed at a specific person in a specific moment, and was allowed to do what genuine curiosity does when it is given sufficient time and sufficient courage, which is to find the true thing. The look found it. It almost always found it. But that was what the look was. That was what Johnny Carson was. And the room, the specific and unrepeatable room on the specific and unrepeatable night when the Hollywood legend sat across from him and felt the full weight of being seen by someone who could not be managed, went completely silent, because silence is the only appropriate response to the experience of something real in a space that is usually occupied by the performance of reality, because the real thing and the performed thing cannot coexist in the same room at the same time, and when the real thing arrives, the performed thing stops, and the silence is the sound of the stopping.